going to start by sort of revealing the secret agenda behind all this, which is that at some point, by the time we get to the end of this series, we would like to be able to have some ideas developed that we can actually turn into something practical. Some kind of thing. We don't want this to be the sort of thing where everyone, we come to the end and, oh, wasn't that nice, and then, forget about it. We'd like this to hopefully take on at least some kind of a life of its own and turn into something helpful or even transformative here in the local community. A little bit about myself. I received my PhD in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. My main area of emphasis was in the Hebrew Bible. And since then I have had a very unusual career that has ranged from doing citizen science to training spies. And now I work doing cyber intelligence for Citigroup, which of course I was totally prepared for by studying ancient Hebrew. Anyway, but the nice thing about having an eccentric career is that you get some insights that you're not going to find in another way. I'm also, along with my wife Denise, we're scholars in residence here at the Episcopal Church of the Good Samaritan. We lead a group that we call the Guerrilla Scholars, which are a group of other people who are interested in learning and thinking and figuring things out. And we have regular sessions, classes, seminars on everything from the Old Testament to the latest findings in cosmology. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, let me know afterwards, or you can talk to Father Simon. So welcome to this, the first of 5 sessions, in which we will explore the ancient biblical approach to caring for the vulnerable and how it can inform our efforts to address comparable problems today. Obviously, the ravages of homelessness, destitution, poverty, and lack of access to health care, these are problems that flow from conditions that are persistent. Here we are, thousands of years after these texts that we're about to look at were written, and we have the same or similar issues confronting us. One might fairly ask that if the people of the Old Testament were unable to solve these problems, why should we bother reading what they left behind? Or we might take the statement of Jesus that you will always have the poor with you, not as an observation, but a verdict. There will always be poor people, so quit trying to eradicate social injustice because you'll never succeed. Before we start in on these and other related questions, I want to clarify a few things first about this weird, wonderful text called the Old Testament. It's more properly called the Hebrew Bible. Christians often forget that it is a Jewish book, after all. I love reminding Christian fundamentalists of that fact. I tend to call it the Old Testament mainly out of ingrained habit. But for purposes of our discussion, here are some points that you need to bear in mind when we look at this text. First of all, the Old Testament is not complete. It is not consistent. There are books that are mentioned in the Old Testament that we do not have. Books like the Book of the Wars of the Lord, the Acts of Solomon, the Visions of Edu, whoever that was. Various other books that are just simply lost, but that the writers of the Old Testament assumed that the readers would have access to. The Old Testament books will not always tell you what their agenda is. They make a lot of assumptions on the part of the reader. You will not find anything in the Old Testament that amounts to a systematic theology or a creed. We believe in bum, 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 bum. You sort of have to figure it out as you go. You have to read between the lines a lot, and sometimes you're left guessing. But that's part of the fun, I guess. The ideas that we find in the Old Testament did not form in isolation. They were part of a larger ancient Near Eastern complex of ideas and policies and politics and history, and all of that had its influence on the Old Testament. The Old Testament is not something that came unfiltered directly from God, if that's how you want to look at it. It shows signs of the environment in which it formed. The history and the narratives that we find in the Old Testament are employed to fashion a series of theological exercises, and that's probably the best way to read this book. The Old Testament is sometimes criticized for being non-historical, leaving aside the many instances where, in fact, the Old Testament does have some pretty good history. History is not the point. The Old Testament uses history, narrative, and myth to make a point. That's an important distinction, but one that needs to be kept in mind. Finally, the ideas presented in the Old Testament were intended to be played with, kicked around, turned upside down, shaken, or stirred. And we see that this going all the way back to very old interpretive traditions. One in particular, a Jewish tradition, which holds that any particular verse in the Hebrew Bible has a minimum of 4 different interpretations, all of which are legitimate. And so it's a completely different way of reading the text and a different way of interacting with the text. We don't have that now. You try doing that with your math book or something, your textbook, or even the newspaper, you're going to end up confusing a lot of people, and probably yourself. So one might fairly ask, one last warning too. When we talk about the Israelites, or Israelite this, or Israelite that, it's fair to ask, which Israel are we talking about here? Are we talking about the sojourn in the wilderness? Are we talking about the time of the judges, which could rightly be considered a period of barely controlled tribal anarchy? Are we talking about the period of the monarchy? Is that before or after the monarchy split into 2 kingdoms? Are we talking about Israel during the Babylonian exile? These are all Israel. And it becomes even more complicated because much of the stuff we find in the Bible, much of the legislation, was written as though it originated in earlier times, or does not give a clear indication of when it was set down. You've also got some further complications, like, for example, you have legislation that was written with the assumption that the temple existed, and there was when the temple did not. You get the idea. It's complicated. For our purposes, I don't want to go too far down that particular rabbit hole. Actually, if we start adding the vast body of Jewish commentary and interpretive literature, that rabbit hole starts looking more like an event horizon, and we just don't want to do that. So, what can we boil this down to? Well, in the summer of 2013, I made a proposal to Stanford University to teach a class on the Old Testament as part of their extension program. They were hesitant. No one had taught a class like that before, and they weren't sure that I could muster the 15 people that were needed to sign up for the class to carry. In fact, 53 people signed up. But that's beside the point. During the negotiations for these classes, they asked if I could cover the Old Testament, all 33 books, in 5 weeks. With 10 hours of class time, 5 two-hour lectures. I agreed, not because I thought it was a reasonable assignment, but because I really needed the money. So tonight, I'm going to try something even more audacious, and that is because since Twitter has become our intellectual forum of choice, I will give you the Old Testament in a single tweet. And that is that the Old Testament asserts that life will prevail over the powers of death. That's probably the most important idea that underlies everything you're going to find in the Old Testament. Now that is a massively audacious and even reckless claim, but for the purposes of our discussion on social justice, I think it holds. And we'll come back to this over time as we do this. If you want to start with the creation, which is a good place to start because that's where the Old Testament starts, you get this idea that life is sort of the central feature of God's realm. It's implicit in just about everything that the Old Testament has to say. And God is sort of the one person who has full control and jurisdiction over life. He can take life, he can give life. Fertility depends on God. That's his thing. And when he creates a world that brings forth life. It's amenable to life. Now, where it can be fruitful and multiply and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at other more or less contemporary creation stories from the rest of the ancient Near East, you find something very interesting, and that is that after the Creator God fashions the cosmos, that God will then institute create various institutions that are considered to be defining for whatever culture belongs to this creation story. So, for example, in the Babylonian creation story, the creator god Marduk, he creates a palace, a great big temple, and it's totally imposing and so forth. In the Ugaritic creation story, the god Baal, he does the same thing. He creates this palace and sets up this political structure that sort of defines what their culture is about, what they feel is important. In Genesis, God does not build a palace, he plants a garden. I think this is incredibly important, and it's something that has been overlooked very much, and needs to be examined more closely. He plants a garden, it's full of living things and whatever is necessary to sustain the things that are in there. And he makes clear, moreover, that the role of humanity is to continue the creative process. So when Adam is asked to name the animals in the ancient Near East, naming something is to not only assume responsibility for or power over it, it's also in a very real sense to participate in its creation. So we are sort of co-creators, and the essence of creation is to make the world amenable to life so that things can prosper, whether it's humans or animals or whatever. So this is a fundamental idea that underlies a lot of Israelite legislation. The question is, did all this, what were the other countries doing for care of the vulnerable at this time? Well, we can take a look. Ancient Egypt, for example, we have a biographical inscription from a tomb where the person notes, I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, and passage to those who had no ship. Charity was a big deal. We have another one here, there. Okay, this is from a Canaanite text that says, one of the duties of the king was to go every morning to the city gate where the citizens gathered and settled legal disputes. There he, quote, helped the widow to obtain her rights and spoke just judgment for the orphan. This is interesting. Most people think widow and orphan, that's biblical language, but no, this was widespread across the ancient Near East. Another one here is a Sumerian law code that predates Hammurabi by almost 1,000 years. The orphan was not delivered up to the rich man. The widow was not delivered up to the mighty man. The man of 1 shekel was not delivered up to the man of 1 mina. I think a mina was 100 shekels. So, it was the 99% were not subjected to the 1%, you might say. So this is, it's a very old one. We also, of course, have Hammurabi, 1800 BCE, so roughly, well, maybe not too far from the time of Abraham. This is from his, here we go. This is from the prologue to his law code, which was engraved on a slab of black dolomite. It's now in the Louvre. And it says, you know, the gods made him king in order to make good the flesh of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak, to rise like the sun over the black-headed people and to light up the land. Black-headed people was an old way of saying the population. And this mention of the sun is very interesting too, because the sun god was considered to be the god who oversaw justice and you know, good judicial practice. At the end of his law code, he has an epilogue that's sort of, in which he declares mission accomplished, in order that the strong might not oppress the weak, that justice might be dealt the orphan and the widow in Babylon, the city whose head Anu and Enlil raised aloft, and Esagila, the temple whose foundations stand firm like heaven and earth. I wrote my precious words on my stela. It's just a rock writing on it. And in the presence of the statue of me, the King of Justice, I set it up in order to administer the law of the land, to prescribe the ordinances of the land, to give justice to the oppressed. This is a very big deal. I didn't have time to put it in here, but there's also a Phoenician inscription by a king named Kilamua, which is just an absolute marvel of political braggadocio, where he goes and he talks about how, you know, the guy who didn't even know what a sheep looked like, I made the master of a flock, you know. I mean, he really goes over the top. It's quite funny, actually. Unfortunately, we don't really have time to give this the treatment that it deserves, but we can simply emphasize, I guess, leave with this, that Israelite law and legislation was very heavily influenced by these legal codes, and particularly those of Babylonia and Assyria. But for tonight's discussion, the takeaway point is that Israel was not unique in its concern for social welfare. There was a significant interest in caring for the poor in the ancient Near East, and in fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that doing so was the primary hallmark of a successful ruler. If you were a successful ruler, your people prospered. That was kind of the one thing that everybody watched out for. So you may have noticed that we use this word tzedakah in the title for this presentation. The word tzedakah is frequently translated as charity. What you see there is a tzedakah box, or a charity box, that you find in Jewish homes or synagogues or businesses where you put in donations to be used to assist the poor. But the word has, you know, more nuances of meaning than that. One of which, of course, is righteousness. You know, someone who is righteousness, a person who is righteous is a tzaddik, which is related to tzedakah. You also have this, of course, the meaning of charitable giving, the tzedakah box. But you also have it being used to, where we would use the word justice. And this is an important point that needs a little extra explication. In our society, justice tends to be a matter of retribution. It tends to be a matter of, for lack of a better word, vengeance. In the Hebrew Bible, it wasn't like that. For them, justice was setting things right, putting things back the way they're supposed to be. So, for example, if you gave money to a homeless person, that is an act of justice, because you are helping to put things back to the way they ought to be. That person should not starve. So you give them food, whatever, that's justice, that's tzedakah. Okay. There's another variation on this idea. You may have heard the phrase tikkun olam, which is a word that means reordering or healing the world. You don't find it in the Bible much, but you do find it in medieval Hebrew, especially with respect to some of the mystical traditions. You find it there, and there's even a magazine called Tikkun. That's a Jewish magazine that talks about various ways people are working to set things right, to reorder, to heal the world. And it really goes back to this idea of tzedakah. I want to talk too about another concept in the Bible which is truly important, and that is hospitality. This is crucial, especially in Genesis, and there are certain rules that accompany this. One of which, of course, was offering food and shelter to a guest. This was considered a sacred obligation, and in fact, even today, in many Arab countries, well, pretty much all Arab countries, the idea of hospitality to the stranger is a very big deal. I recently read some accounts by French travelers in the 20s who went to this Palestinian village and looking for a place to stay, and a brawl broke out over who would have the honor of hosting these travelers. That's how important it is. Hospitality was also important because it helped create a social fabric, especially in areas where there was a sparse population. The host was obligated to see to the needs of the guest, no matter what. This obligation even extended to the point that they would risk the health and welfare of their family members, sort of like Lot does with his daughters when he's protecting the messengers from the men of Sodom. That was a horrible, horrible thing, and it just makes your skin crawl to think about it. But according to the tenets of hospitality, that was precisely the right thing to do. So that's how seriously they took it. There was an Arab tradition, in fact, that everybody deserves hospitality. There's a saying, "You will offer shelter even to your father's murderer." That's how seriously they took this. And the reason why was because it was a matter of survival. And we'll see more of that later. Of course, the signal example of hospitality in the Old Testament in Genesis is Abraham. And we have the story where Abraham sees these messengers, 3 men, and he runs to meet them. He bows himself down and says, "Please, come and have a little bite to eat, rest yourselves, take it easy for a little while. I'm sure we can scrape something together, for a meal." And so he, this is his idea of a light meal here. He measures 3 measures of choice flour. Now, a measure is a seah. If you do the math, it comes to roughly 5 gallons of flour, okay? Which he turned into cakes. There's an entire calf that was slaughtered and cooked for this. So, we do know, basically, Abraham's household was eating veal sandwiches for the rest of the week. You had, and then he stood by them while they ate, and there were, of course, curds and cheese, and it was just this lavish lunch that he put together for these people. And it is just after that the messengers say, "Oh, and by the way, they're going to have a son." That's not a coincidence. The next episode is when you see these messengers going to Sodom, and Lot and his family take them in at what turns out to be great personal risk. The men of Sodom, to make a long story short, violate every tenet of hospitality that you can possibly think of, and probably a few that you haven't. They abuse and threaten to abuse and extort, or try to extort from Lot whatever they can. And you have to realize that whoever wrote this is trying to explain why God was justified in turning the city into a smoking hole in the ground. And the one thing that everyone would agree on, that no, absolutely they deserved it, was to violate the tenets of hospitality. Now, I know there's a school of thought out there which claims that Sodom was destroyed over homosexuality, and there's a very interesting way to take a look at that. There are 24 or 25 references to Sodom outside of the book of Genesis. Nearly all of them are discussing the fact that Sodom was destroyed, and they usually give some kind of reason for it. None of them mention homosexuality. Nearly all of them mention exploitation and abuse of the poor. So when the Bible interprets itself, you should pay attention. And it's pretty consistent on this point. So now before I want to get back, go too far, there's another kind of fun little thing here. And that is when the promised son Isaac was old enough to get married, Abraham sent his servant to go find him a wife. And he did this. And the servant is basically being charged with finding someone who will help Abraham's family survive. He wants someone who will make sure that the line continues. What's the one thing that will ensure that? Well, the servant is the one who says to God, send me a woman who, if I say, could you give me some water? She'll say, drink, and I will water your camels also. Now, we need to do some math on this, okay? So I apologize. There's a story problem coming up here. The servant of Abraham started out with 10 camels going across the desert. Rebecca, roughly about this time, this is a typical water pitcher from that era. They run between 2 and 3 gallons in capacity. We'll call it 2.5 just to make it easy. And one camel coming out of the desert will consume about 25 gallons of water in one go. I mean, they'll walk up to the thing and they'll just drink like crazy. In fact, they can literally drink themselves to death if you don't watch them carefully. So the story problem continues. How much water did the camels drink? Well, that was 25 gallons each. That's 250 gallons. How many trips did Rebecca make to the well? It was 2.5 gallons per draw. That was 100 trips to the well. Bonus point, this is over a ton of water. Okay? So what is the point that the Bible is trying to make here? We talked about how they don't use history to prove a point, they use history to make a point. What is the point that's being made here? And in fact, this story, we know this story comes later because at the time that Abraham is presumed to have lived, or wherever the story is set, they were still a good 500 years from domesticating the dromedary camel. So obviously this was added later, but why? What was the point being made? The point being made is that Rebecca was the perfect mate for Isaac in order to continue Abraham's family because her sense of hospitality was just as lavish as Abraham's. And that was key to their survival. You survive, you get the blessings of God when you are hospitable, when you take care of your fellow human, your fellow beings. Hospitality, the takeaway points. How you treat the stranger is critical to your survival. How you treat the person who is vulnerable. And few people are more vulnerable than someone who's traveling through the desert. Hospitality must not be grudging. It is to be lavish. Bad things happen when you flout the rules of hospitality. And I should also mention these ideas were found throughout the ancient world, not just in the Bible. You find stories of blessing for hospitality and cursing for ignoring it everywhere. You find it in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in the cuneiform literature. I mean, it's everywhere. So much for Genesis, which is kind of the prologue to the more nitty-gritty parts of the law, of Jewish law. And that brings us to this concept here, which is the idea of the resident alien, the ger toshav, or the ger for short. The way you treated the resident alien or the foreigner was something that compelled some rather liberal and lenient law codes on the part of the Israelites to dealing with people who were living among the Israelites, but who were not themselves Israelite. Now, at this particular time, you couldn't, there was no way to really convert oneself to becoming an Israelite. You were always, Uriah the Hittite, for example. You always maintained that identity, even if you were living among the Israelites and conducting business there and had done so forever. It was possible after, I think it was like 4 generations, that your descendants could be considered Israelites, except for Moabites, in which case it was 10 generations. Israelites and Moabites had this love-hate relationship, only without the love. So it was possible, that a ger could become wealthy, but most of the time they weren't. They were poor. They were listed among alongside the orphan and the widow and so on. And the reason why was because they were not allowed to own land. And in an agricultural society, that's a huge disadvantage. The ger, for the most part, would work as a farmhand or an artisan or some other kind of commerce. And they didn't really have any family to speak of that they could turn to for support. So they were kind of out there. They were exposed. The obligations of the ger were fairly modest, actually. They only were supposed to obey the prohibitive commandments, the thou shalt nots. That would be homicide, adultery, blasphemy, that kind of thing. They were not obligated to obey the performative commandments, like observing the Feast of Weeks or the Passover sacrifice or those sorts of things. And that was pretty much where it stood. There are reasons for that we won't go into here that are kind of more theological and we need to get into. But I want to kind of take a side switch over here and look at the legal protections that they gave to their immigrants. These legal protections, and these are taken straight out of the Torah. The same Torah and the same mishpat. A mishpat is a word for case law. So this would be, court decisions or whatever that are not specifically in the Torah, but are that have kind of evolved as a superstructure, a legal superstructure over it. The same law and mishpat shall apply to the ger who resides among you, as it would to the Israelite. You are not to oppress the ger, for you were once gerim, that's the plural, in the land of Egypt. You shall love the ger as yourself. So this is like love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, even the one who talks funny. You love him as yourself, for you were gerim in the land of Egypt. In his commentary on Leviticus, an old professor of mine, Jacob Milgram, wrote, the term love is not an abstraction. It connotes obligation, commitment, reaching out, providing not only fellow Israelites, but also the local alien with his or her essentials. Now, let's leave that for a minute. I want to talk a little bit about, we'll leave the legal section and go to the prophetic literature. The prophets had a lot to say about caring for the poor, but the context of their preaching was that by ignoring the plight of the poor and ignoring the vulnerable and in fact exploiting them, the Israelite nation or the Jewish nation was putting itself at existential risk. And much of the motivation for putting the Bible together in the first place was to answer the question, what went wrong? Why did it all fall apart? Why did the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple, destroy the Davidic dynasty? In other words, every covenant that defined Israel at the end of that period was in ruins. It was completely gone. What happened? Why did we fail? And the Torah, the Bible, in fact, offers several explanations For example, one is that in the book of Chronicles, they make the argument that, well, they didn't do the rituals quite right, you know. And there are others that say, well, we somehow messed up on the covenant thing, and that was wrong. And there are also some places that say, hey, we were fine. It was God that screwed up. You know, He was the one that abandoned us. The prophetic voice was rather different. They were adamant, especially the classic prophets, what we call the classic prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets like Hosea and Amos. They say, no, it was because you ignored the plight of the poor and the vulnerable. So here's probably my favorite example of just how seriously they took this. This is Isaiah, who absolutely takes no prisoners. And this is in the first chapter of his book. This is how he basically starts out. Once he gets to clearing his throat, which is, you know, maybe about 9 verses in, this is when he really starts to unload. He says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the teachings of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. When you come to appear before me, who asked this from your hand? Trample my courts no more. Bringing offerings is futile. Incense is an abomination to me. New moons and Sabbaths and calling of convocation. I cannot endure solemn assemblies with iniquity. Your new moons and your appointed festivals my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean." And now we come to the chewy center, which is, "Remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rescue the oppressed. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow." That's it. The whole kosher enchilada right there. You know. Now, there's a lot. Okay, obviously the comparison with Sodom and Gomorrah is kind of an attention getter right away because he's making a very unsubtle comparison and an equally transparent threat about what's in store for these people if they don't get their act together. There's a lot that one could unpack in this message, but there's one point that needs to be emphasized, and that is that Isaiah is willing to do away with the entire religious superstructure. All the religious institutions, all of it, the sacrifices, the meetings, the festivals, the feasts, the incense, all of that, throw it out if that's what you have to do in order to preserve yourselves, and that means taking care of the vulnerable, taking care of the poor. That's how important he felt it is. And just to let you know, he's just warming up, okay? Like I said, he takes no prisoners. You know, as with Abraham, taking care of the vulnerable is a matter of survival. We neglect the poor literally at our peril. Now, Israelite legislation had a number of different things that they did to help the poor. I'm just going to go over them very briefly here because we'll be going back to them in later sessions. But these are kind of interesting. One of them was free food gathered from other farms at any time. Gleanings were available to the poor. Farmers were to leave the marshes of their fields unharvested, and the poor could come and take what they needed. There was a produce tax that was available for the poor every 3rd year. Every 7 years, the land was left fallow, and its spontaneous produce was allowed for the poor to collect it. It's believed that when this was put into place, they would have different plots of land under fallow, you know, going through their Sabbaths at different times. So you had something happening, you know, at any given year for the poor. Loans were required from the well-off to the poor, required, and not, gee, it would be nice. There were limits that were placed on the collateral that the poor were asked to offer for loans, and in some cases that collateral would be returned to the poor person. For example, the big example is you have a guy, all he owns is like a cloak. He puts that up as collateral. At night when it's cold, you have to let him have it back so that he doesn't freeze in the night. Interest-free loans were made to the Israelites. Every 7 years, outstanding balance on a loan, personal loans, not like international loans or things like that, were forgiven. And at every seventh year, the year of Jubilee, land reverted to its original holders if that land had to be leased out or hawked or in some other way relinquished in order to pay off some kind of debt, and whoever ended up with that land had to keep its original owners on as farmhands to work the land. So they got to stay on the land, but they didn't have ownership over it or its produce. There were also fallback positions like bond servitude and things like that for the people who were really in trouble. We'll go into that later because it is rather interesting what it was they considered important and how they did things. Concluding thoughts. In order to solve these kinds of problems, we have to do some unpleasant self-reappraisal sometimes. We have to be willing to acknowledge the capacity for evil that is in our midst. Sometimes this is something that we in mainstream religion are reluctant to do. We like to think of ourselves as honorary sinners. We don't, we're not, frankly, as honest as we could or should be about the darkness that we have to confront and where it lies. And I think that we need to embrace a new kind of spirituality that involves, that is an active spirituality against those things that create problems, that create injustice in the world. And one last thing that I want to mention, I spent a little bit of time kind of on the fringes of the intelligence community, and I got to become familiar with a kind of intelligence work that's called national assessment, or sometimes called nation-state analysis. And it's a rather esoteric kind of intelligence work where you look at various factors and you try to assess the stability or the health of a nation-state. It is a fiendishly difficult thing to do because you're basically saying, well, are they going to have a revolution in 10 years or what's going to happen? You ask 100 different analysts how they do it, you're going to come up with 100 different methodologies. But the one thing that everybody seems to agree on is that the wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots increases the potential for political instability. Everybody seems to agree on that, so it really is a matter of survival. Each generation has to grapple with these problems, and now it's our turn. And with that, I'll turn it over to Missy.
Hi! Wasn't that awesome?
Yeah.
Now, you know I was so excited. Because I was so excited. So, I did a handout for y'all because I'm a professor and that's what I do. So, I wanted to tell you a little bit about who I am first. So, I have, even though I look so young, I have about 25 years of advocacy experience. I got my start in high school when I used to do walkouts in my town of like 2,000 people. My high school only had 300 people in it, so usually I was the only one walking out, but I had to stand up for things that I thought were important. I have my master's degree in social work from the University of Utah, my PhD in social work from USC. Don't judge me, they paid me. I was on scholarship. I'm a writer, I'm a creator of passion, I'm a wife and a mother. I still listen to the heavy metal music I listened to in high school, and I drive my Camaro like not very responsibly sometimes because I like to go really fast. But my husband told me I needed a car that reflected my personality, so the Camaro works really, really good. So So I was so thrilled when Sheldon approached me when we first actually started coming to church, and Sheldon said to me, so I understand you like advocacy, and I was like, it's like my blood, it's everything that I am. And he said, well, I've been thinking about putting together this lecture series where we talk about the safety net and the Old Testament and things that are happening today. And I was like, yes, that's fantastic, because I know nothing about the Old Testament. Let's be really real. I grew up in Utah. I'm like a Mormon-ish, like Mormon light. Like, I don't know anything. Now I'm becoming an Episcopal. Things are happening. I don't understand the Old Testament. And so, but what I do understand for real is that we don't live single-issue lives. And I live in a very intersectional space, which is becoming the groovy term for making sure that we're addressing how people cross over in multiple ways. Usually it's through race, class, and gender. I like to do it through the lens of rurality, women's health, and religion. That's what my research is on, and that's what I focus on. And so I feel like there are just really remarkable opportunities to take the things that Sheldon just discussed with us to talk about the safety net today and what's really happening from a policy perspective, because that's the world that I run in, to look at how policies disproportionately affect people and where those lines intersect and are drawn. And so I really feel like, and I feel this especially here, but I feel that as a community that we have the collective power to come together to make an impact in our communities. And no matter how we define our community, whether it's our religious community or the community that I create in the classroom or the community I have as a parent, or just as a revolutionary, the way we define community, we can come together and create power structures that infiltrate the membranes of the people who are in power. And I feel like that's my graceful revolution, is really trying to figure out how to give people the tools to infiltrate the power structure so that we can make changes that are good for everybody. Because as Sheldon so astutely pointed out, it is to our peril not to do so, and to take care of the vulnerable. So I have this really favorite group of revolutionary women in Russia, actually, who they're a punk rock band that does really revolutionary acts in Russia, and they were put in a gulag for speaking out against Putin. And one of them has said, "Tyrants thrive when populations feel unstable. Institutions seem like they have massive power, but they are actually incredibly fragile." And that's really what I'm going to talk about tonight, and sort of highlight some of the things that Sheldon talked about, only in current form. And so I really want to focus on the fact that this is a marathon, not a sprint. Making change in policy takes a lot of time, and it should. It should be deliberate and thoughtful and intentional. And I think sometimes, especially for people who are younger even than me, I see this in my teenage daughter all the time, they're like, why can't this happen right now? And you highlighted it when you were like, let's do it in 140 characters. Like, people want change right away, and that's just not how policy works, and it's not how it should work, I don't think. So the three things I really want to talk about tonight are the safety net policies of nutrition, housing, and health. And it's interesting you brought up the GER, because if we're talking about immigrants coming here, one of the current things that's happening is that there is a move to take away the ability for immigrants to qualify for these programs because they can't prove their residency. And so it's really interesting that you brought that up, because it's a critical piece to how we treat people coming into the country and whether or not they can find stable footing to be able to feed and house themselves. So the first thing I want to talk about is the nutritional safety net. And when I'm talking about the nutritional safety net, which is actually run out of the Department of Agriculture, so as you can imagine, the people who work for the Department of Agriculture don't have a lot of training in social work because they're farmers. And so they're making policy on nutrition that is complicated by the fact that they probably have not had a lot of interpersonal experience trying to get food stamps or send their kids up for school lunch or any of those other things. And so what the benefits to the nutritional safety net are that it reduces food insecurity, it raises incomes, and it reduces child poverty. So what does that look like here in Corvallis or in the real world? What it looks like is when my husband and I moved here, we got on a really tight budget really fast because a lot of things changed for us from where we were, and our kids had to go on school lunch. And it was great because I just filled out a form online and they got on lunch, and it was great because now they get breakfast and they get lunch, and that's helped us in our pocketbook so that we can figure out how we are going to raise our income and help us find security so that we can move forward off of getting school lunch so that someone else can do that. And that's really the purpose of the safety net, is to really help people get on their feet while they're struggling and then push them forward. So there have been new proposals that have been put in place to change the nutritional safety net here in America. One of them, I don't know if you heard about this, was the introduction of the American Harvest Box, it's a way of shifting food stamps from a voucher system to a ration system. And what's really critical about understanding this is that when it's a voucher system, families can make decisions about how they feed their kids and how they feed themselves. So if you are an elderly human who has nutritional needs that affect diabetes, heart disease, cancer, or any of those things, then you're not going to want to drink shelf-ready milk, powdered potatoes, ham in a can. Do you remember government cheese? Yeah. That's what they're talking about going back to. And the critical piece of this is it's going to affect 4 out of 5 families that are on SNAP. It also means that anybody who receives more than $90 a month in benefits will be affected by this program. And so all of their free agency and ability to make meal decisions for themselves and for their families are going to be taken away if something like this moves forward. Now, there's no question that all of these policies in our safety net could run better. I come from a space where I tend to run on the fiscally conservative side because I was raised in Utah and that's how I believe. And I actually can see a lot of places as a social worker where these things we could really make a huge impact in the way we engage in the safety net and save taxpayers millions of dollars if we just looked at things a little bit differently. But taking the power to plan your meals and plan your family's lives, I'm not sure is the best way to do that. And I think, to go back to the Old Testament teachings that Sheldon was just talking about, I think it's not going to address the issue of whether or not people can access safe and healthy food. This would also mean that people wouldn't be able to go to farmers markets like they've been able to with their SNAP benefits now. And I think so we're cutting fresh vegetables out, which we know is not the best idea on the planet. And so I think that having the knowledge of what's at risk so that we can decide in our own lives if that's something that interests us and that we are willing to advocate about. Now you have the information so you can look at it further, so we can figure out how to continue programs, nutritional programs that reduce food insecurity, raise incomes, and reduce child poverty. So the next thing I want to talk about is the housing safety net, which we all know because we've seen this in Corvallis. I've even seen it in the last year, where homelessness is on the rise. People are living 1 or 2 paychecks away from not being able to pay their rent. This is happening across the board in every community in America. It's not unique to Oregon. It's not unique to the Western Seaboard. It's not unique to people in Mississippi or New York. What's happening is that people are living at a space where they're much closer to the edge than they've ever been before. So the housing safety net has tenant-based rental programs, which is typically what you think of as Section 8. It's got project-based rental programs, where the money goes directly to the landowner. They're paid directly. It's not paid through rent by the renter. And then there's community planning block grants that fund homeless shelters and other special housing projects in communities all over the country. And those in particular, the community block grants, are critical to funding homeless services and ensuring that transitional housing exists for people who are either homeless and moving back into housing, or who need, like Cardiff, who is our domestic violence shelter that we help support as a church. they all get funding from community-based block grants, and those are at risk right now with Congress and the current administration. And so the reason I highlight these is because of our commitment to helping the homeless and helping people who need homes and who are escaping violent situations and need housing, because the housing safety net reduces crowding, housing instability, and homelessness, and it really helps low-wage workers make ends meet. And so that support reduces poverty and it reduces healthcare costs. People who have housing are much more likely to be healthy than people who don't. And so they're much less likely to use the emergency rooms and all of those other services that we hold so dear. And it also provides access to safer neighborhoods. So especially I think it's more critical in urban areas where if you have the support of low-income housing, you can get yourself into a place where you're living in a safer place for you and your family. One of the things that I think is really critical to understand is that, and we're going to talk about this later when we talk about the lone woman, but I want to talk about it a little bit right now. Women who are homeless, 25% of the adult homeless population is an unaccompanied woman. So 1 in 4 homeless adults is a woman. Typically, she's over the age of 55. So she's moving into her second half of her life in her later years. She typically has escaped a violent situation and has nowhere to go, but because the domestic violence shelters are underfunded and overcrowded, she might not have anywhere to be, and so she ends up on the street. And those women are suffering from diabetes and heart disease and cancer and all of those things that people, as we get older, experience, but they don't have access to health care. And so I think that one of the places that are really a unique space, and there's several organizations that are trying to start focusing on this. We've done such a good job of at least looking at veterans, and in some places, like when I was doing work on homelessness in Salt Lake City, they now have they have housed all of their chronically homeless using a model of taking over old hotels and converting them into studio apartments and getting people in those hotels. So I think if we focused on women next, we would have a really incredible opportunity of creating, and I've seen them here in Corvallis, I've seen them along the river, those women. They tend to hide because it's safer to be hidden, and so it's hard to identify them and find them, but when we do, I think there's a unique opportunity to help them, and so that's one of the things that Sheldon and I have talked about highlighting as an issue. So what's at risk with the housing safety net is there's been an introduction of a concept of doing minimum work requirements to receive housing. So that means that we are asking people to work before they can get into a home. But if you don't have a home, you don't have a home address to tell somebody where you live when you're doing filling out an employment application. And so we're creating this circular system where you can't have a house, but you can't get a job without a house, and we're creating this circular system with minimum work requirements, which they are also talking about using for SNAP, for the nutritional safety net, and also the health safety net. They also have the tax bill that was just passed undercut the value of tax credits for building new affordable housing. So for builders and landowners who were looking at investing in building more new affordable housing, the tax credit for that got cut out of the tax bill, and so the incentive, because incentives drive behavior, and incentives are usually financial, the incentive to build new affordable housing in many communities is going to be gone because they won't get the tax benefit from having mixed-use housing in new development. There's also no exemption for parents caring for children or adults caring for aging family members in the reforms that they're proposing for the housing safety net. So what that means is if you are an adult caring for an elderly family member or you are a parent caring for a young child, there's no exemption for that minimum work requirement, and volunteering or taking care of a family member is not work under this requirement. And so you also run the risk of losing your housing if you're caring for a child or an elderly person in your home. And the last thing is that there's proposed rent increases that are being proposed by Congress and also by the administration that disproportionately affects the elderly and disabled. And so there's no protection anymore under these new proposals to save money and sort of cut the amount of money we spend on housing, that there's no exemption for the elderly and disabled in any of the proposals. And so potentially we could be seeing rents increase for our most vulnerable populations here in the country, which is going to create a further chunk of homeless people, only this time they're going to be elderly and disabled, which is really going to put them in very vulnerable positions. So I think that sort of paying attention to the work requirements for all of these policies, but especially for housing, is really critical, especially if it's something that we are going to continue focusing on as a community. And let me just say, this can sound very daunting. And I know this can sound overwhelming, and I know especially, this is why I always tell my students to focus on city, county, and state politics, because federal politics gets so overwhelming. But the reason I bring this to you all tonight as a part of just introducing you all to the safety net in general and the policies that are happening, being proposed at the federal level, is that's the money that trickles down. So it is states that decide how much money the counties get. So the State Department of Housing will decide how much the Departments of Housing get in each county, which will decide how much the Departments of Housing in each city get here in Oregon. And so it's really critical to understand these things that are happening. You don't have to get into the meat of it. I don't even get into the meat of it, and I'm a policy wonk. Like, this is what I do for a living. So I don't even get too in-depth into this because it's overwhelming and it can be very disheartening. But if you can find this space in any of these things that light you up or make you feel inspired to help or to have knowledge, then that's where you can connect to the policymakers and the stakeholders and the leaders in the community who are dealing with this at a much more local level, as long as you understand what's at risk from the federal level. So that's why I bring it to your attention. Don't get overwhelmed. We can actually do something. I've done it. So the last part of the safety net that I want to talk about is the Department of Health and Human Services. And the health safety net is actually not defined. So the nutrition safety net and the housing safety net, anywhere you go online, is actually defined as a program. But what's fascinating about our healthcare is that the health safety net is actually described as a web of professionals and institutions that provide care to the poor and uninsured regardless of their ability to pay. And this goes back directly to what Sheldon was discussing about the Old Testament. Literally, our health safety net is set up as a literal net to help the people who need health care the most. And it includes Medicaid, Medicare, and CHIP. CHIP is the funding source for kiddos whose parents aren't poor enough to qualify for Medicare, but who don't make enough to be able to buy into the regular insurance market. We know this, we've heard it, but I think it helps to talk about the fact that it does actually improve health outcomes for people. It does help people, it helps children and pregnant women disproportionately, and it improves health outcomes for people in rural areas. And I know that Corvallis is not rural, but it is close enough to all these other rural communities that we are deeply affected by the health safety net and how people access health care in Philomath and Lebanon and all these other, and Sweet Home and all these other places outside of us, because they come here to our community because of the hospital. And so understanding how things work here from a rural perspective is really important. So what's at risk? One of the things the ACA did, and the ACA is the most imperfect health policy I think I've ever seen in my entire life, and I've been doing healthcare policy for like 15 years professionally. It's imperfect, but it's something. And one of the things that it did is it put consumer protections in place, especially for people who were dealing with insurance issues. And that is being eliminated right now. That is at risk. And consumer protections are critical for all of us, but especially the vulnerable and the poor. The second thing that's at risk is the elimination. George Bush the First, when he was a congressman, and Richard Nixon put together the Title X Family Planning Program. And that program provides women who can't access contraception and preventive health care with their health care. And that puts a little over 20.2 million women at risk for losing their health care if Title X gets chopped completely. And I bring up who sponsored it because many times now in 2018, it gets pushed as a liberal sort of agenda item, to use their words, but it's actually a very conservative policy that saves us as taxpayers lots and lots of money when it comes to all of the other welfare programs that if these 20 million women couldn't access contraception and preventive care, we would be paying for. And so it's a really critical program for women to have the ability to plan their families, because healthy moms make healthy babies, and it's really important to allow them to access their health care. The third thing is CHIP, which they saved it at the end of December, but that only went until March. And there's no indication that they're going to renew the funding for CHIP again. If there's no political motivation, it likely won't happen, which would leave 9 million kiddos without health insurance. And then the last thing is they're talking about privatizing Medicare. And completely privatizing Medicare, which will affect a lot of people in this room. It will affect my mom and dad. And the privatization of Medicare would increase premiums for anybody who uses Medicare services. And if you're talking about these elderly folks who are waiting for low-income housing, who are living on the edge anyway, and now we're going to increase their premiums, I think it's going to be catastrophic. And it's just like Sheldon said, the way we care for our most vulnerable is indicative of who we are. And so I do not say this to make everybody sad. My students always say, Dr. Bird, your classes are the worst. And I'm like, I'm just informing you so you can go out and do something amazing and take action on something. But I really believe, and I've seen it here in this church in particular, my husband and I were very nervous about coming here to church. I needed a church that was feministy and social justice-y enough for me. And he needed a church with lots of Bible because he was raised Baptist and Catholic. So we had to find a space where we could both come to church. And we did. And now watching this community and how it takes care of the vulnerable here really speaks to how we want to see other people in Corvallis live healthy, fulfilling lives, regardless of their class, their gender, their race, their sexual orientation and gender identity, or their religion or ability. We have a community. I was so excited. I only put 4 tables out because I didn't know if anybody would come tonight. And look at all of you here. And that means by the end of these 5 weeks, and I hope you invite more people to come because I really want to make this a community-wide thing. I hope by the end of 5 weeks, we've come up with some really amazing constructive things that we can take from the Old Testament to inform how we engage in policy practice today. Because what Sheldon has talked about and what I have talked about is the ability to build broad-range support across the community and really take care of our vulnerable in ways that won't take too much out of us, but really give us the opportunity to talk to Senator Merkley's here tonight. I didn't realize that, so sorry, poor planning on my part, because I had a thing to say to him. But, to really give us the opportunity to talk to our local elected officials and the people that represent us to propose policy structure or advocacy structure or community-based stuff that we could do to help impact the people that are most vulnerable in the safety net. And so I'm just really thrilled you all were here tonight. The last page of my handout is several links where you can get more information about all of these 3 safety net issues. But we also, the way Sheldon and I visualized the last part of this going is we wanted to give you all the opportunity to ask us questions or get further clarification on what both of us talked about, and then sort of talk to you about this is how it's going to go. So Sheldon's going to speak, and then I'm going to speak, and then we're going to bring everybody together to have further communication about what questions you have, and also ideas that you might have for moving forward on each of the topics for the next 5 weeks. And then it will culminate into a really amazing last session in the series to really have some good strategies for moving forward that will be informed by all of us. So thank you so much for having me. I just think y'all are so nifty.